exposed it worldwide. In April, just last April, the US-based app class Dojo was revealed to harvest data on how British school children behave. So enter MathWorks. I chose this because it's a teaching resource and product for DIT. Is everyone based at DIT here?
No.
Oh, is no one based? Okay, I wanted something topical and familiar for the class. MathWorks entitles DIT to install products on institute-owned computers, but as well as the staff and students' personally owned computers. It has offices worldwide. Its policy statement says that it takes privacy very, very seriously, but it nonetheless concedes that it collects information about students and teachers when they use its product and services. It lists some of the categories of info that it collects, including who you are, where you live, what you do, your bank info, your IP address, and also information collected by third-party service providers, which are integrated into its platforms. This level of detail might be particularly problematic in relation to the third-party apps it connects to. So the amount of information gathered here, it contributes to a map of who you are, who you communicate with, your interests, and also your financial situation. The policy states it will hold your info for disclosure in response to requests from public authorities and also from law enforcement agencies. So again, there's that question of informed consent. Do you know your data is being collected? Do you know it's being held? Do you know that it might actually be distributed to a law enforcement agency in a way that is, again, not necessarily with your knowledge or consent or through due processes like warrant applications? So given the level of privacy encroachments, one has to ask what the everyone else here will be able to pronounce this word, pedagogical? Did I say it right?
Yeah.
Pedagogy? So what the value with respect to pedagogy is in terms of bringing these apps online, and are those values outweighed by the health, safety, and privacy implications of their use? Biometrics. Biometric data is the brave new world that we're in. It's any information that can uniquely identify you as an individual, and it's obtained through a variety of digitally based techniques. It's most commonly associated with your iris scans, with facial recognition, with voice recognition, and with fingerprints. We see it popping up in schools, in cafes, in libraries, lockers, building access, and also to authenticate student identities upon enrollment and in an online course attendance. Biometrics has grown exponentially without any according increase in the regulation or oversight of who can collect this data or why. So I had a look at the sort of biometrics that are used at DIT. I didn't find a lot of info. I did see that there are CCTVs in common areas, and the DIT safety statement and policy acknowledges that. So CCTVs are a somewhat controversial issue in Ireland right now. Experts are saying that despite the lack of evidentiary basis, that CCTV actually increases safety or deters crime. CCTV is still being sort of installed in increasing levels. And the problem with these cameras is that they can now be used for facial recognition, and that some commercial systems are starting to combine facial scanning with identity systems to sell as solutions for pupil registration. So again, we've got these cameras. I'm not making the claim that DIT is doing that. It's a larger process that other schools are using. But again, we've got these cameras that are purported to be in place to protect students' safety. There's no evidence that they actually do, but then they have these secondary functions that are in fact commercial. It's also not clear how long school CCTV images are kept today, and it's not clear who's being informed about their existence or use. And these things can also be hacked. In February of 2018, there's a report that CCTV footage from several Blackpool schools were being streamed live on a US website. So you think of it, that you're walking around on campus and you're being viewed in an entirely different area of the world. So, just as an aside, another really controversial issue in Ireland right now is the use of public services cards, they have a biometric aspect to them. And for students, I think you need them in order to access certain housing as well as certain grants. So there's been a lot of pushback against that use as well, because again, if a data system is hacked, if it's your phone number, you can always change your phone number. But when information starts to have biometric components, that's private and it's ultimately unchangeable. So. Another fun aspect of educational life is web monitoring. I had a look at the DIT policy here. It says that information on web courses activities is collected routinely and by its service provider, Blackboard, and that DIT reserves the right to monitor user activity. So web monitoring software in schools can also be quite invasive. It's been common in schools since 2016, and I'm not making this claim for DIT, but in other institutes, it can go so far as scanning and profiling students' every internet search, surveilling their screen content, and if a student types a keyword that matches a watchword on a privacy list, automatic flags can be created on permanent records. In some instances, web monitoring enables IT admin operators to see a student through their webcam. Schools also impose this kind of software on personal devices, so students can actually be carrying these webcams back into their private homes where the IT admin people have access to visuals within the students' houses. So again, this is often argued for in the name of safeguarding, and I would return this to this idea of Generation Z's ambivalence and joking about having a familiar person in your webcam who's always watching you. But it's important to remember the asymmetrical power relations fueling these jokes, and to point out that those who are ambivalent about surveillance are those that can afford to be. So one of my rights organizations are in Egypt, and if you are an LGBTQ student in an Egyptian school, and if you are at active risk of unlawful detention simply because of your orientation or because of your gender identity, your right to privacy at your local school becomes a much more serious matter. Similarly, students in the UK have been subject to sometimes automated monitoring by their educational institutes' so-called prevent duty. Now, I didn't have time to check, but does prevent duty manifest here that anyone's aware of? No? Okay. This duty requires relevant schools to have due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. Notes can be held on records indefinitely and shared with the police. And they also show up in statistics. The unidentified authorities are notified if someone tries to browse to one of an unknown set of websites, but the school and teacher who knows the child may not necessarily be contacted. These flags are therefore created and can be acted upon for intervention without context or local knowledge. And there's this problem, there's this clunky ability of software to actually target a real would-be terrorist. And this has been debated and it's been a problem. The result is that some students are wrongly labeled at risk of illegal behavior. Data or assumptions are recorded sometimes incorrectly and sometimes in permanent ways. Students and young people should not find that software in place for their safeguarding causes them lifelong reputational risks and real harm. That's the heavy part of the heavy, scary part of the talk. So that sort of speaks to the level of this privacy encroachment that we've discussed and how deep it can go within an educational context. So I think it's important for educators to really understand the notion of consent. We use it in a lot of different contexts, but we also need to start thinking about it seriously when it comes to profiling, when it comes to apps, when it comes to biometrics and content monitoring. Many students and also teachers may sign generic ICT agreements, but in these contexts, when you're just presented with a stream of words and a little box that you click on, that consent is clearly manufactured. And even if there is a clear itemization about what you're consenting to and you're fully aware of it, again, that idea of consent is also manufactured because some of these processes are vital to simply being a student. As we discussed, you need Blackboard. It's something that you can't get out of. So going forward, I've made some very sort of broad suggestions about the ways that we can manage students' secure and private data. We need to secure university databases and guarantee students access to the info held about them. They deserve to know at the very least. They have a right to know about what's happening. There needs to be clear safeguards put on profiling and automated decision making, the ones that have significant effects on students about their ability to move forward and live their best life. We need to place obligations to restrict biometric data to that which is strictly and absolutely necessary and also proportionate to the goal, and to ensure proper oversight. If we're looking to put biometric fingerprints into cafeterias simply so students don't have to use cash or a bank card, we have to think, is that necessary? Is that proportionate to the level of risk attached to what they're handing over? We need to create policies that underpin and enforce good practice, that bring clarity and consistency to confidential data handling. And we need to do what we're doing today, which is to provide education in schools and teacher training on digital rights and responsibility. And I wonder if this website, I'm just going to bring up a website too.
Just got 5 minutes left.
So this is righttohide.com. My organization put it together, and it's a really neat, helpful little website about how you can secure your own personal data. So it tells you about how WhatsApp can share information, and it provides alternative communication apps. For example, Signal, that are encrypted. Signal prevents commercial companies from seeing your data. Signal prevents the government from seeing your data. Signal is so good that it can't even read your data. It's a really sophisticated tech program, and it's one of many that are described here. So I recommend you have a look. It's a very helpful website. And that's me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, for that maybe slightly scary talk. Anybody feeling completely petrified now? We have about 5 minutes for, actually, 5 minutes for questions. Any questions from the floor?
Just tell us a bit more about what that website is.
Yeah.
It's called righttohide.com. And it just tells you how you can browse privately at home when you're researching something. It provides alternatives to Google. It shows you how to have a private web chat conversation. So instead of using Skype, you can get what's called a Jitsi room. It's free, it's completely secure, it can't be infiltrated. It shows you how to protect your private data on your computer using better authentication methods so that other people can't open it and hackers can't come in and browse. So just a lot of useful little tidbits. They're all free, they're all from open sourced and ethical companies, and they're just great for raising awareness and protecting your privacy.
Anyone else?
So I'm just wondering about the mobile apps or the sites that we encourage our students to go on, and can everyone download such an app and go to use it in class? But there's awareness around where that information, that data is sitting. The students maybe have to set up an account, therefore they're giving email addresses. And so it's only since GDPR came in that we've even started having these conversations in our own office amongst ourselves as to what we should or shouldn't do and where do we look for answers,
Yeah, it's a hard situation. Best case scenario, you're turning your student into a product that you're selling to a commercial company. That's best case scenario. Worst case scenario, you're creating tracking mechanisms that can be used by law enforcement or create permanent records of your students. So it is good to be very aware of the types of things that you recommend to your students. It's always best to go with non-private, non-commercially invested apps. It's best to go with open sourced apps that are very clear in their privacy policies and don't have a commercial interest in sharing your students' data. It's best to go with apps that have built-in privacy protections that governments can't access. Even if they brought a court order, some apps are so sophisticated that the information just disappears and there is no way to compel production.
It's how to help the layperson find out that information. When I read terms and conditions, a lot can go right over my head at times when it gets into technical aspects of where data is held, how it's used, or whatever. And like I said, when it runs to pages, you tend to just accept and you keep going. So it's where to what to look for.
This website's really great for personal purposes. It's very clear. It's targeted at laypersons. It comes in several languages. But I'm not an educator, so all I can say is this is how you protect your personal communications. In terms of like larger education apps, again, I think it would be looking for those open source products that are very clear about their privacy policies.
Can I just sorry.
The law at the moment, it's changed in the law here, London,
Right.
people have a lot more rights in terms of say, access to the information. You're not supposed to hold information that somebody longer than you need to hold it. You're supposed to get rid of it. There's a whole set of regulations that come in. People may not be aware of them, but institutions are not supposed to hang on to the information indefinitely. You're only supposed to use it. You have to state the purpose you want to use the information for. The person you have the information on is entitled to know what information you have on them and can ask you such, and you have to present it. And there's a right then to anonymity as well. You want to get rid of it, you want to become unknown, you can become unknown in relation to the institution.
The data protection and privacy laws in Ireland are not good.
Well, I think they've been updated though.
No, they haven't. So for example, data retention, there was a report that came out from a judge, very conservative institution that doesn't make grand claims. He said the data retention law in Ireland is basically conducting a system of mass surveillance in Ireland. He says it's illegal according to EU standards and needs to be shut down. I gave submissions to the Oireachtas in November about why their next bill that they came out have produced to solve that problem. I gave submissions about why that bill, which is attempting to replace an illegal act, is still a problem. The data retention systems in Ireland are very scary, and when a conservative judge says there's a system of mass surveillance in place here right now, then we tend to listen.
So are you saying to me that we have no rights in relation to our information that institutions hold us?
You have fundamental human rights to privacy, absolutely. Are those rights being safeguarded by the legal institutions in Ireland? Not necessarily.
But I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to just jump into 2 questions that I'm dying to ask. One is a lot of what you've been talking about is around informed consent, which is really important.
Yeah.
But I know there's other arguments that are being talked about in relation to educational institutions and learning analytics specifically. And one of them being legitimate interest. So, for example, institutions potentially putting forward the argument that it is in the institution's legitimate interests to gather and monitor data on students' interactions with, for example, virtual learning environments like Moodle or Blackboard, because without that data we can't provide the service or support that we need to provide. Now, I'm not advocating for that, but it's just an argument that I know is being put forward. First of all, how do you feel about the idea or the concept of legitimacy and what is legitimate or not? And one other question which I'll pop in with is how feasible do you think it is to retain some level of privacy in life today and engage with the institutions and engage with life in general, given the pervasiveness of digital technologies?
So briefly, the first question, I think the legitimate interest of an institution to conduct a business never outweighs our fundamental human rights. So the human right to privacy is always a stronger overriding right. So I think that answers that very quickly. Are we in a private world online? We're not, unless we take very specific steps to prevent encroachment. So unless we use clear tools that are always evolving in response to surveillance techniques used by institutions and governments, it's safe to say that your communications are not private. It's further complicated, again, when you go into an educational institution that mandates that you use certain tools like Blackboard. So yeah, it's an ongoing problem that the GDPR and other laws are attempting to solve, and it hasn't been solved at this stage, but there is ongoing advocacy from folks like the ICCL.
And also, like, societal norms of what's acceptable or not have kind of creeped.
Friendly FBI agents in your computers. Say hi to him before you go to sleep. Ask him if he wants to watch like Frank and Gracie on Netflix with you that night. Yeah, like people are ambivalent, and I mean, there's this idea that if you're behaving well and you're doing everything right, then it doesn't matter if someone's watching you. But if you're in the bathroom first thing in the morning brushing your teeth, do you really want someone standing behind you watching you brush your teeth? It doesn't matter if you're breaking the law, you're still entitled to privacy. And as we've seen, certain laws are very unjust and should be overridden by fundamental interests.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we're just coming up to 3 o'clock and we have another session due to start shortly on your digital footprint, which is a nice lead on, I think. Can I just say thank you so much to Elizabeth? It was really interesting and certainly a lot of thought.
Yeah.